Do we have too much government?
We need to put people ahead of corporate profits.
This system is so lopsided.
This threat is a real threat to democracy.
And I think that's really important. That's something we haven't been doing in this country for a long time.
Where do you start? What do you do? How do you do it?
Access to Democracy and other Eagan community television programming is supported by Thomson Reuters, makers of Westlaw Next and based in Eagan. Through Westlaw Next and other innovative online services, Thomson Reuters is the world's leading source of intelligent information for businesses and professionals. Online at thomsonreuters.com. And by U.S. Federal Credit Union, the member-owned financial institution offering service, value, and experience you can trust to the greater Twin Cities community.
And welcome to Access to Democracy. If I had a voice, it would be saying Alan Miller, your host today. And I would say on Friday the 13th, we have good luck, not bad luck, because Steve Hunegs is back with us as a guest. And to him, I would say, Lashana Tova.
Shana Tova, Alan, thank you for hosting me, and great to see Sharon and the entire team.
And here we are on Erev Yom Kippur, the day in which Jews all over the world atone for their sins. You know, they gave me a week.
They gave you a week?
Yes, they gave me a Yom Kippur week. They said, you can't do it in one day. So
a long period of introspection for all of us, right?
I guess so. Steve has been with us numerous times, always in education and always in enjoyment. The world is spinning so fast right now. Yesterday, in the United Nations, Syria, which didn't have chemical weapons, signed on to the chemical weapon ban and said, well, yes, you can come and monitor our chemical weapons and collect them. So I found that fascinating. Syria allied with Putin. There's just so much going on. How does this affect Israel?
It's always a pleasure, by the way, to be on the show. Thank you. You're a great interviewer. I'll be slightly funny, although there's nothing funny about this situation, but I'll say, you know, matters are in turmoil when Secretary of State Kerry decides to take a break and visit with Prime Minister Netanyahu on Sunday about the Israeli-Palestinian negotiations. That's his hiatus, because he's spending his time trying to deal with Vladimir Putin and the Syrians and their chemical weapons. But you're 100% correct, Alan. The world is spinning very quickly. Details, events, presidential speeches are all transpiring very quickly. Circumstances are changing. The Israeli perspective with respect to Syria is stay low, say little, be prepared. They recognize the great sensitivity of the situation. Last thing they want to do is compromise anything that our country is attempting to do with respect to Syria. It's a very complicated
Well, with
situation.
Assad at the helm, they pretty much were at arm's length. They weren't having problems. There was an aura of war, but not any activity of war, so to speak. And here we are now with Assad under attack by his own people, and we don't know who's going to prevail in that. And that could certainly affect Israel.
That's certainly true. Today marks, at least on the Jewish calendar, the 40th anniversary of the beginning of the Yom Kippur War. Now, by the Gregorian calendar,
That's right.
It'll be October 6, 1973, October 6, 2013. However you reckon it, those 4 decades have been an epical time in the Middle East. In that time, Jordan has made peace with Israel. Egypt has made peace with Israel. Israel's had a long-standing series of negotiations, unfortunately, generally fruitless, with the Palestinian Authority. Nevertheless, they are engaged in negotiations. Looking back at Syria in that time, as you say, the border at the Golan has generally been quiet. There was always sort of an implicit understanding between Assad Sr., Hafez, and Assad Jr., Bashar, that it wasn't wise to trifle with Israel militarily. However, that did not prevent Syria from crossing Israeli interests with respect to, say, Lebanon, but more importantly, arming Hezbollah and assisting Iran, two very dangerous tendencies on the part of Syria. Yes, the Golan border has been quiet, but that doesn't mean Syria in any sense has been any sort of partner in peace.
And it's interesting also with Iran, because we have Ahmadinejad, who said that the Holocaust never took place, being replaced by a new prime minister who speaks at least more peacefully.
Well, that's open to question too.
And
Listen,
we have to find out.
We all hope he has peaceful intentions. Let's not get off on the wrong foot there. But in practically his inaugural address, he still referred to Israel as a wound that must be cleansed. So take this very seriously. The Iranians continue to be the highest order troublemaker in the Middle East, even from their Persian perch a little distance away from the heart of the Middle East, by continuing to arm Hezbollah, by being the #1 supporter of state terrorism, according to the State Department, and by perhaps now accelerating their program towards nuclear weapons. We'll talk about...
I think what happened this week really benefits certainly the United States, benefits Israel, and contrary to all the right-wing attacks on Obama, I really think that nothing would have happened until Obama came forward and said, we are going to strike Syria. Russia didn't want us to strike Syria. That's the last thing the Russians wanted. While they support them, they're not going to send troops in there. And so I think that's what compelled Putin to take the steps that he had, to jump on something that Kerry said in passing. And really, we have a whole new ball game in Syria since last week.
The president, in some way, reflects the befuddlement of the nation in a certain aspect. Everybody appreciates the fact that it is completely 100% intolerable what Bashar Assad has done in killing 100,000 or more of his fellow Syrian citizens. The president had talked about red lines, perhaps in a way that was not as tight as one would hope, and then of course the poison gas was used, putting everybody in a real dilemma, because in our country, after Iraq, after Afghanistan, after many American lives, soldiers, male, female, much money has been spent, the American people are wary of another Middle East enterprise, quite rightfully so.
They don't want another war.
They don't
There's
want
no
another
question
war.
about it.
Nevertheless, the Americans are great humanitarians, and it appalls us all. Secretary of State Kerry said an atrocity. It is an ongoing atrocity in Syria. So I think you're right. The president is in a difficult position. There's been critiques of him of the left and the right. The Congress has not been following him in the sense of supporting what he wanted to do.
That's another thing. Contrary to the last two wars that spent trillions of dollars, and we were led into by W. and Cheney, without Congress, basically, they committed us into those conflicts. Obama says, I'm going to go to Congress, and let's hear what they have to say.
It's a really interesting question. I'm no expert on the War Powers Act, certainly no expert on that aspect of separation of powers. We have the executive turning to the Congress almost immediately and saying, are you going to give me authority to act in the nation's defense? Interesting to see over time if this is going to be a watershed event. We talked, JCRC, we had a trip to Israel in August.
Tell everybody first what the JCRC does.
The Jewish Community Relations Council of Minnesota and the Dakotas, and we have many different missions. One mission is to educate the public, members of Congress, the press, about Israel from the perspective of the Jewish community of the Upper Midwest. We're Americans, we're not Israelis. We have a sort of unique set of relationships and views about Israel. So we took
As
with us...
As do other ethnicities.
Oh, absolutely.
Italians with Italy, and, you know, Irish, Scotch, British, because we are a melting pot, and these people are all close to their background homes.
Well, I think
Certainly the Scandinavian people right here in Minnesota.
have a deep attachment to Norway or Denmark or Sweden or Finland or from whatever, which of the Scandinavian countries from
Yeah.
which they come. We had the privilege of taking Representative Noam, who is the member of Congress from South Dakota, Christy Noam, Sean Duffy, who represents Northwestern Wisconsin in the Congress, and Jim Sensenbrenner, a very interesting and wise man who was the third-ranking Republican in terms of seniority and former chair of the Judiciary Committee from Wisconsin, to Israel.
He's an enigma to me. I can't understand him because he sounds like he makes sense one time, and then the next time he's completely off the wall.
He's working very diligently with Representative Lewis on restoration of the Voting Rights Act in response to the Supreme Court decisions. He's also right at the center of the Patriot Act debate right now. So by my lights, he's working very hard to find a center of gravity on two very critical issues. But this isn't about Jim Sensenbrenner. When we went to Israel, we had an opportunity, I would say, probably a once-in-a-lifetime unique opportunity. We spent an hour with Prime Minister Netanyahu. There are 15 of us in our delegation. It was the Prime Minister, our delegation, Mark Regev, who is the Prime Minister's spokesperson, and Israel's next ambassador to the United States, who was part of it. So we had a high-powered team with whom we were meeting. Show you how things change. That was sort of your thesis statement. Everything's in turmoil. Things change. In that discussion, practically the entire time was spent talking about Iran. What the Prime Minister did when we came in, all seated, formal room, cabinet room, little nameplate for everybody, stood up for about 3 minutes and gave more prepared remarks. That was for YouTube because it later appeared on YouTube. But then he sat down at the table with us and wanted to talk with him. We talked with him about a range of issues. Not everything, but most on Iran. If Syria came up, it was probably the role of Syria as a proxy for Iran or the general destabilization in Syria and the humanitarian crisis of the 2 million Syrian refugees. But certainly this poison gas, all the issues that are on the table today were not present because they had
And
not
this is
happened.
only a little over a month ago.
Let's see, we were there from August 5th to 12th. We must have met with him on either August 8th or August 9th, 2012. So exactly, we're 5 weeks out, and that subject line has changed. But I think in our little publication here called The Voice, which is, our staff did a great job putting together.
If you hold it up, I think Scott can probably pick it up on the camera.
Right over here.
And
Certainly, if anyone would like it, we'll send it to them. We call it sort of an intimate discussion with the Prime Minister of Israel because we did have an hour with him, which is something that we'll probably always look back upon and
to get
marvel
an
at.
hour
Good an hour
with
the Prime
somebody
Minister.
like Netanyahu is really rare.
I would think so. It was an interesting day for him. He had some school children along with him, and he brought them in to introduce them to us, some sweet children from all over Israel. And then he sat down after his prepared remarks, sat down with us, and we had a sort of, I would say, derech eretz, the Hebrew word for sort of down-to-earth conversation.
A frank and down-to-earth
There
conversation.
it was. One topic on the table, and I'm sorry not to make this a monologue, but I know you're very interested, was also Palestinian-Israeli negotiations. And one of the folks asked him, well, you just released 104 terrorists jailed since before Oslo, since 1993. Most of them have blood on their hands, sometimes the blood of women and children. Essentially, how could you do that? And he said, well, this demonstrates to the entire world my commitment to jump-starting the peace process between the Palestinians and the Israelis. This was the price of getting back to the table with the Palestinian Authority, and I was willing to pay it, no matter how painful it was and no matter how much criticism I received from practically all quarters in Israel.
And he's received a lot of criticism from all quarters, particularly the far right, even more than the far left. But ask Israelis, though. Ask Israelis if they would like to see a two-state solution. And I did that. Sharon and I were over there about 5 years ago. for the last time. As you know, I spent Operation Desert Storm over there, among others, and I just saw an article from last week's Jerusalem Post about Kfar Blum. In '85, I stayed at Kfar Blum and actually stood on the river where the three countries meet. It's like it's a river, but it's like a stream, a tiny stream at that point. But Kfar Blum in the far north, and near the Golan Heights. And in '85, we were fortunate enough to be, not '85, when we were there 5 years ago, fortunate enough to be taken up to the Golan Heights and see some of the embattlements there, and realize how strategically important that area is.
You showed me the clippings that you wrote from 1991. A very impressive set of reporting that you did at that time. You talk about the Golan, and I don't mean to talk of woeful things, but 40 years at the Yom Kippur War is just so fascinating. There was a long article in the Jewish Telegraph Agency yesterday or the day before about, they finally released Golda Meir's testimony to the commission that was set up to investigate why Israel was taken so badly by surprise in the '73 war. And she had the painful decision finally, when the IDF intelligence and the Mossad drew the conclusion, after all the evidence that they saw, that the attack was coming. Golda Meir, about 24 hours in which they knew the attack was coming. And they decided to absorb the first blow. They believed that was the correct political decision to make at that time, that the preemptive strike was just too risky from a geopolitical standpoint. Proved to be correct, by the way, that assessment. But here she was, knowing what was coming, and they could only mobilize the soldiers so fast. And she had to live with that the rest of her life. Israel lost 2,500 soldiers in the '73 war, and there was Golda.
Which, for a country of only a few million people, is a tremendous loss.
Tremendous loss. '48 war, the War of Independence, there were 600,000 Jews in the pre-state community of the Yishuv. 6,000 killed. That was 1% of the population killed.
Yeah.
2,500 killed in the '73 war, which is not to, by the way, minimize the large numbers of Egyptians and Syrian soldiers who were also killed, often very bravely, in the '73 war. The '73 war, so interesting because Israel went through a period where they were very hubristic. Part of the reason Israel was taken by surprise in the '73 war is they believed that the Arab nations were not capable of launching a successful attack against Israel. Well, everyone found out that the Egyptians were able to engage in a successful amphibious assault across the Suez Canal, and then they found out that the Syrians were able to use their surface-to-air missiles as well as their anti-tank, wire-guided anti-tank missiles to great effect against the Israelis. Many people don't appreciate the fact that by about day 2 of the war, the Israelis were down to about 40 or 50 tanks on the Golan. The Syrians did not believe their own intelligence. Their own intelligence was telling them the road to Tiberias was practically open, but they refused to believe it, interestingly enough.
It probably was their undoing also.
I mean, ultimately it was, and
Yeah.
on the other end of the war, General Sharon made an amazing military maneuver and went on the other side of the canal and trapped the Egyptian Third Army, and ultimately the Israelis repelled the Syrians from the Golan, and the road to Damascus was open. On the Sinai front, on the Egyptian front, the commingling of the forces essentially forced the Egyptians and the Israelis had been wanting to do this all along, to actually sit down themselves without interlocutors and negotiate the disengagement. Sadat was smart. He had an end game in mind. That was to rekindle Egypt's sense of honor, successful surprise attack to some extent, and then use that as a basis for exploring a more peaceful solution to the Middle East. He paid for it with an assassination, but ultimately, before that, made the trip to Jerusalem and became one of the authors of the Egyptian-Israeli peace treaty.
Assassination, unfortunately, is not unknown. See also Rabin.
See also King Abdullah, the present king of Jordan's grandfather,
Right.
who had negotiations with Golda Meir, to mention her name a second time. And for his efforts, he was assassinated at the mosque in Jerusalem in 1950.
Well, we have 8.5 minutes left, so let's fast forward
Okay.
to today.
Sorry.
Minnesota Supreme Court dismissed a lawsuit where they were seeking to have the state divest itself of Israel bonds. Tremendous victory, I thought.
We worked very closely. For the most part, we took the lead in defeating this divestment effort in the legislature and then within the DFL party and also before the State Board of Investment. Of course, it was the Attorney General's office that had the responsibility for defending the constitutionality of the actions of the State Board of Investment, which was to purchase Israel bonds. Although we went and watched the different hearings on the matter.
Among dozens of other bonds
Oh, sure.
that we invest in.
We have, the state of Minnesota as large, part of a multi-billion dollar, like $40-50 billion portfolio, has overseas investments. Part of those overseas investments are bond holdings in other nations. It's just part of having a diversified portfolio. The irony is to pick out Israel, who has never defaulted on a bond, who has a relatively strong economy, whose high-tech sector and agriculture sector and medical sector continue to grow very strongly.
Not only to grow in some respects, particularly in the high tech and the medical, they're really among the top countries in the world.
No doubt about that.
Progressive action.
You go, there's a great website, Israel 21C, and you can read about everything that Israel contributes to the world. You talked about the turmoil in the Middle East. If you could only somehow lessen the temperature in the Middle East, find a way, the parties don't have to love each other, the countries don't have to love each other, but there is so much potential that could be unlocked in the Middle East between Israel and her neighbors for the good of the world, that
Particularly for her neighbors.
for her neighbors, indeed, that it's a tragedy in and of itself that so many people on all sides have suffered generation after generation.
And
But
so many people want the two-state solution. As I said, 70%, according to something I read recently, and certainly everybody I spoke to when we were over there this last trip, they all said, we have to have peace with Palestine. Actually, if they don't, the Arab population may outproduce the Jews in terms of population at the rate they're going.
the clock does not tick in anyone's favor. Let's put it that way. The longer that the Palestinian Authority goes without statehood, the more marginalized what's left of sort of the mainstream Palestinian Fatah becomes. As you correctly point out, Israel faces demographic issues too. So it's always in all sides' best interest if an agreement can be reached that safeguards everyone. The problem the Israelis always face is they're always trading the tangible for the intangible. They trade land for peace. But once you give away the land...
And they don't have that much land.
And they don't have that much land to begin with. But what would have happened? It's an interesting question, Alan. If, say, in 2000, Barak and the elder Hafez Assad had some serious negotiations over Golan, broke down over about 200 yards, really. Interesting question of where would we be today if the Syrians were back on the Golan Heights in exchange for a peace treaty with Israel? What would that peace treaty mean now? Interesting question.
It certainly is.
Interesting question.
Now, you recently had an article, an op-ed, responding to Jason Lewis, one of my least favorite right-wing commentators, about the Jewish and Israel lobby.
I think it was actually
which
Ethan Roberts of our staff who did an
he
outstanding
sort
job.
of denigrated it.
Well, his thesis was that so much of the Congress was held sway by Israel or Israel lobby or whatever the case it may be, or that lobbyists, Jewish lobbyists, were out lobbying on issues related to sequestration and the like, and military cuts and the like. But the truth is, there's just one of so many lobbying people that lobby on Capitol Hill.
There are
And-
4 times as many lobbyists as there are people in Congress,
Yeah, right.
including their employees.
Exactly. And every day, the members of Congress are lobbied by so many different interests that to say any entity, any group controls the Congress is ludicrous. And the sad thing about it is, besides the fact that it's factually incorrect, is that it raises old stereotypes.
Which is
Too.
exactly, I think, what Jason Lewis wanted to do.
Right. Well, he wanted to stir the pot a little bit. It's kind of unusual because I think in the past Jason has been more or less friendly towards the Jewish community and Israel, but obviously on that given day there were some issues that he wanted to raise.
Now, I'd be remiss if I didn't talk about the fact that Michael Karkow, who is alleged to be a Nazi commander or a commander under the Nazis, has been living here in Minneapolis for over 40 years. People say, how does this thing happen? How does something like that happen? Well, to me, it's easy. They lie on their initial papers when they come in for naturalization or admission to the country. And I would recommend to anybody who finds this mysterious to watch the movie The Music Box, because The Music Box is based on a true incident, very similar, that took place in Chicago. And it will explain a lot.
I'll speak generically to the issue because it's under investigation.
And because you only have a minute and a half.
There's a good idea too, Alan. I'll speak quickly instead of generically. How about that? Or both. When the issue was raised, we responded that if true, if the allegations were true, this were appalling and the government should take appropriate action, to which some people said, this man is 90-odd years old. Let him live out his life in peace. What harm can he cause at this point? That's not the issue. I think of, he's from, allegedly, the alleged person from Northeast Minneapolis. So think about this. You had Patrick Henry High School, you had De La Salle High School, you had Roosevelt High School, okay. The schools in the area in which the alleged criminal, not actually war criminal, lives. Those boys went off to the European Theater of Operations, many of whom were killed in action. Can you imagine sort of the historical insult that is to those Northeast Minneapolis boys, young men, who gave their lives for our country, to have walking the streets named for presidents of the United States, someone who allegedly is a war criminal? He should not, if true, should not be living in this country.
Well, my attitude is also, if true, and we only have a half minute left, if true, what about all the people who never had a chance to grow up
That's true.
and live their lives? If it's true that he was part of this assassination unit, what about those people? Doesn't society owe them something? And my answer is yes. That will play out. This interview has played out. Steve Hunegs, always an education. Never get to talk about everything I have down here, so let's have you back, not a year from now, but a few months from now, and let's see where we go with all this.
It's always a pleasure
Thank
to
you.
be with you. Wishing everyone good health.